Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Geri, a League member and your host. Each program we talk about important public policy issues. We hope you'll discuss those same issues, and then at election time you'll be ready and willing to go vote. This program we're going to talk about the Election Integrity Commission and voter registration information. And to do that, we're going to be speaking with McLarty, Huppert, who is the Director of Voting Rights for Nebraskans for Civic Reform, and also an attorney. Welcome, Bree.
Thank you.
Well, let's start out with, it's been a lot in the news lately. The League and Nebraskans for Civic Reform have talked about it in statements. The Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, or the EIC. What is it? What's its purpose?
So it was originally started through an executive order from President Trump. I think that was done in about May, and the stated purpose was to investigate if any voter fraud that's been happening across the country, and also to investigate any voter suppression. The most recent data request that we've seen from the commission shows that they're leaning a little heavier on the voter fraud and not really addressing, or maybe even have concerns about, the voter suppression issue. It's a committee of about 10 members. Their goal is to investigate, and so far what we've seen is a huge breach of privacy in some of the data that they've been requesting. Okay. Well,
I know the League has come out with a strong statement that said this is basically a fishing expedition for voter fraud. I mean, it's starting from a premise that fraud widely exists, and that's pretty spurious in terms of a belief, I think. So Vice President Pence and then the Secretary of State of Kansas, Chris Kobach, are the co-chairs, with Kobach more or less taking the lead on the commission. We don't really think the commission is that much interested in facts, but rather is looking for reasons to remove voters from the voting rolls. What do you say to that?
I would say the data that they requested shows that that might be their intent. When you're talking about looking not only for personal data, but also voter history, they asked some additional things like whether or not they've been convicted of a felony, social security numbers. It looks a lot like what Mr. Kobach's interstate voter registration check asks for, and then goes and tries to purge voters. So we think that that's pretty similar to what they're trying to do. We just find it kind of interesting when you look at the makeup of the commission. It's about 10 members. I think there used to be 7 Republicans, now there's 6, 1 resigned, and 4 Democrats. So we find it very interesting that it's a Republican-heavy commission looking into this, trying to talk about the integrity of our elections in the midst of all of this talk of Russian hacking. But that's the same party, the Republican Party, that's trying to dismantle the Election Administration Commission, whose sole job is to make sure that technology and data sources are secure, and having these restrictions and regulations to make sure that the machines that we're using are safe and secure. So it's an interesting juxtaposition when you look at what's happening across the country, the purpose of this commission compared to what they're doing in all other aspects of election administration.
Okay, and the big thing that came up just recently, which made the news, was basically the first act from this commission, which is one of the assistants, the Secretary Kobach, asked the states for information on their voter registration rolls. So do you want to talk about that? States did not react really well to that request.
No, so, they did not take that very kindly.
I think he wanted things you already mentioned, names, addresses, party affiliation, voting history, information on felony convictions, and the last 4 digits of social security numbers. I think that one kind of really got to people.
That's what really sparked the red flag and had a lot of Secretary of States really start balking at this request. First of all, the fact that it was just a letter. A lot of these states, Nebraska included, have specific statutes about what information is publicly available. A lot of states like Nebraska have taken the pains to really balance voter privacy and security with accessibility and voter engagement. So for example, here in Nebraska, via statute, the election commissioners and the Secretary of State can provide the voter registry to interested individuals. These are usually candidates, nonprofits, with the whole goal of they want to use this information to reach out to voters, to talk to voters, to get them to go vote, which is a noble calling. I know the League uses this as well. So we have statutes that are there to balance it. We say, okay, you can request this information, but you can only use it for certain uses. And here in Nebraska, we limit those to voter registration, as well as voter engagement and election activity in general. The fact that the commission never said what it was going to use it for means it's already running afoul from the get-go of Nebraska statutes and other states as well. So we really have to look at what the balance is, and that's why we have these rules. The commission decided not to even look into what states require and just sent a blank letter, I guess just hoping that some of the Secretary of States would forget that they're bound by the laws and just send all this private data. So how they decided to do it is the first red flag. Then you start talking about they'd like the last 4 digits of your social security number. No,
that
that's
makes people nervous.
That's where the wall happens. So to calm some of the voters here in Nebraska, how it actually works in Nebraska, because we're worried about this data being breached,
Yes.
is when someone includes that on their voter registration form, that's used to verify that they are eligible to vote in the state of Nebraska and in the country. Then after that, it's never stored with the voter registry. So here in Nebraska, that information isn't even available. What they do is, by statute, the Secretary of State is required to create what's called a unique identifier, or a voter identification number. It's not your driver's license and it's not your social security number. It's a specific number that's given to you when you register for the first time in Nebraska and follows you through your entire voter history. So if you were to move 6 or 7 times, your address may change, but your VIN number is the same. And that's what we do in Nebraska to make sure that information like social security numbers aren't breached or accidentally published, and also not given to commissions that ask for them.
Okay. So really, it showed a naivete for the commission in terms of just blanketly asking for this information and not understanding that this is complex and that states handle things in different ways. In fact, even the state of Kansas, he's the Secretary, Kobach's the Secretary of State of Kansas, and he couldn't release some of the information he was asking for.
And naivety is a great way to describe it, but that also makes me think if Mr. Kobach, who has introduced several pieces of legislation in Kansas and pursued some pretty stringent voter ID laws, and he's even come to Nebraska to try and get them to pass it here, you have to wonder why. Why didn't he make sure he followed the rules and request the data as it's supposed to be requested and follow those guidelines in other states? But then also, why submit these requests before they even have a public hearing? They've met in private, but they've never actually publicly had a hearing where people can come and testify or provide input. So I don't know if this is a cart before the horse, a naivete, or he just doesn't care. He wants the data. He's going to try and find a way to get it, see if he can get it easy. After that, who knows what's going to happen. So it's definitely raising a lot of red flags that he's not doing this the way most commissions and most people that care about transparency and integrity would go forth and do it.
Right. Now, you mentioned that so many states, I think it's 44 states, have refused to provide the information without some other assurances. Let's focus on Nebraska. What did our Secretary of State, John Gale, he's one of the Secretaries of State who said, nope, not going to give this to you until I have some questions answered. What did he say?
So what he first did was he raised some specific concerns, and these were concerns that the ACLU of Nebraska and NCR also raised prior to his statement. We wanted to know how they were going to secure the data. In so many different interviews with Mr. Kobach and other members of the commission, they said that their intent was to publish it online, to make it so that anyone can look up this information. I mean, we're talking about people's voter history as well as whether or not they're a felon, personal information, contact information. Once it's out there, you can't control how it's being used. So that was one of the first concerns that Secretary Gale raised is, one, how are you going to secure the data? And then second, how are you going to make sure that it's being used only for the specific purposes? If Secretary Gale were to have handed over the data, he would have had a serious lawsuit on his hands, because Nebraska law says you can only use it for a couple of key purposes. And once it's out there on the internet, who knows what it's going to be used for? So that was one of the things that Secretary Gale wanted assurances of before even considering giving out data. The second is he did note that there is some publicly available data, but there are restrictions about what that is. So for example, social security numbers, as well as the information of domestic violence victims that are in address confidentiality programs. That information cannot be given. So those are some of the things that Secretary Gale wanted to hear about and get answers from before even considering giving that information. Then the second part, as he said, is that they were going to have to follow the law and do it the way they're supposed to. They're going to have to send a public records request. They're going to have to sign the affidavit. And so far, we haven't heard if the commission's even willing to take that step, let alone all the assurances that he's requesting.
Right. And my understanding also is in the letter, I mean, the Secretary of State was wise to question this, but a couple of the ways that they were suggesting states provide the information weren't really secure.
Yeah, I think they wanted just an Excel document. Yeah, there are no parameters about whether or not they should send it through a secure network or it should be encrypted. So for kind of a juxtaposition, when you talk about some of the interstate compacts like ERIC, which is the Election Registration Information Center, it's a compact of about 20 to 22 states, and they're kind of trying to do what this commission is not doing very well, which is making sure that data can be securely shared between states to find those duplicates. So when someone moves from California to Nebraska or from California to Minnesota, they share data, say, oh, you know what? Nope, that person did register in Minnesota. California got the notice, yeah, it looks like this person moved. They talk to each other, they use multiple match points. I think they have to have 7 to 12 match points before they even consider it to be considered a duplicate. But all of this is in a secure database. All the information has to be sent a certain way. States sign on with an MOU. They pay money to make sure that they can really invest in security so all the data that's shared is secure. So that's really concerning that they never even put out, here, send it this way so we can make sure it's secure as you're sending it and then once we receive it. So that's probably one of the most concerning parts is just, it was a letter and that was it.
Okay, so the whole request has sort of stalled out, but not only because secretaries of state have balked at providing information, but there are 4 lawsuits that have come up. So why don't we talk about the lawsuits that have been filed? I know the Electronic Privacy Information Center was one of them, one of the first ones to file a lawsuit.
Yeah, and so with that one, with the Privacy Center, I know that they were looking specifically, was that the requesting the data, right? They had to give the reason?
Yes.
Yep. And so this is what's really interesting about lawyers is, my gosh, they'll find anything. I actually had to laugh a little bit to myself when I just saw the creativity in I think the Paper Reduction Act was probably my favorite one.
Yes.
But this is one of those times where I know it sounds like bureaucratic red tape, but it's there to protect people. And this is what all of the lawsuits that you see, they all have that out there. They're there to either protect the voter, protect the privacy of a citizen, or to protect the integrity of our elections. And looking at the Hatch Act, that's exactly what it's doing. It's looking at making sure that we don't have this perception or even this actual conflict of interest. Mr. Kobach has sat there and put on his campaign materials that he's leading the charge against voter fraud, including being on this commission, while the Hatch Act says, as a federal employee or a representative on a commission, you cannot use what you're doing in the federal government while running for office.
And that's the one the Brennan Center for Justice, I think that's the Paper Reduction Act. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights is the one that did the suit for the Hatch Act. And we should let our viewers know, voters and viewers know, that Chris Kobach, the Secretary of State of Kansas, is running for the governor of Kansas. Yeah. So that's where the Hatch Act would come into play. Then the ACLU has also filed a lawsuit. Do you want to talk about that one?
That was the Federal Advisory Communications Act?
Right.
Yep. And that's the one that requires that meetings be public.
Right.
And for Nebraskans, that's really important. When you look at how our legislature runs and how our government runs, we're about transparency and we're about making sure that everything is available to the public and that the people that are going to be living under these laws have the opportunity to interact with it and to have their say. So if you look at the legislature, every bill has a hearing. They're not only broadcast over public access television, they're also broadcast online, and people can go and watch them and interact with their state senators. So for us, looking at the fact that nothing so far with this commission, besides the letter that's been plastered all over the internet, has been public. And so the ACLU has a really good point there that you're talking about whether or not data is going to be given. You're talking about how elections are going to be run in these countries, or in our country, in these states, and you're not at all allowing public input. And that's a huge concern.
Okay. And then the fourth lawsuit is one that's rather creative, I guess, the Brennan Center for Justice. Talk about the Paperwork Reduction Act. Says there's a violation here.
The first time I saw that bill, that lawsuit, I was actually surprised. I couldn't figure out what it was, and I read further. I'm like, that is just a very creative use of the legal services. But what the Paperwork Reduction Act and what the point that the Brennan Center is trying to make is that you have to say why you're asking for the data. So right now they're asking for significant amount of personal and private data from voters to be sent to them from the states, and they've never really said why. We've got some inklings from interviews, like I've said before, about they want to make it, they want to publish it online. It sounds like they also want to cross-reference it with different federal databases. One of the ones that has been kind of thrown around is the non-citizens database, and this is what really concerns voting rights organizations like NCR and the national organizations like the Brennan Center is why? And how well are they actually going to match? With Mr. Kobach's interstate voter registration cross-check, there's been a lot of issues with it. It's a flawed methodology, so much that states have actually left the compact because it's resulted in so many duplicate or erroneous duplicate registrations where then people have been removed and they got the wrong person. There's a lot of Joe Smiths, John Johnsons, but when you're talking about cross-referencing it with the non-citizens, you're going to start getting real U.S. citizens that are being purged because their names match those that are on the non-citizens list. And that's a huge concern for a lot of us because what they're talking about makes it look like the goal is to purge voters,
Yes.
not to make sure that the data is accurate.
Right.
And with the interstate cross-check that Mr. Kobach has put together, you've seen that happen in Kansas. He hasn't been using it to make sure that voter rolls are clean. He's been using it to prosecute people.
Right.
So he's not using it for its intent. He's instead used this as a springboard to find people so he can run around saying he's stopping voter fraud.
Have many states, now did Nebraska participate in the cross-check program? Are we part of that?
Nebraska is currently a member of the interstate cross-check program, and
Okay.
NCR has been working to try and get Secretary Gale to join ERIC. The difference between the two is what data is collected and shared, the security of the data, but then also the methodology that they use to match. With ERIC, they have so many more points that have to match before they can consider it a duplicate. With the cross-check, it can be something as simple as a first and a last name and a birth date. And so that's where we're getting some of these issues with false duplications. So that's why we really want Secretary Gale to look at ERIC, and if he's serious about integrity of our data here in Nebraska, then he should invest in tried and true methods like ERIC and not turning over private data of voters to this commission, or even honestly continuing to participate in the interstate cross-check.
So that's one thing our viewers could do, which is to encourage the Secretary of State to switch programs and use something that is much more reliable, probably, in looking at getting duplicate registrations.
Yeah, that would be a great action item for viewers and for voters.
Okay.
ERIC is not something that's required by statute. It's something that Secretary Gale has the authority to do. He would just need a little extra money. So that's one that we would like to work on in making sure that he has the funds he needs and the resources he needs to join.
Okay, great. Well, we've focused a lot on the Election Commission, Election Integrity Commission, so-called. But let's focus on something else that was like, it's very ironic, if not coincidental, that on the same day that this letter went from the Election Integrity Commission, the Department of Justice got in on things in terms of voter registration and sent it was not as widely reported probably, but a letter also to the states asking the election officials to detail compliance with one particular section of the National Voter Registration Act. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll first start with, I'm not going to say we were surprised. A lot of the voting rights organizations have been waiting for this kind of turn from the Department of Justice. After the election last fall, we wanted to make sure that we archived as many things from the Department of Justice's website. They have a great civil rights division. They did on the website, had a lot of great resources and I'm not going to say rules for states, but interpretations to help guide on what is considered a violation or not. So we as organizations took the pains to archive a lot of that, knowing that a lot of it's going to be taken down. And we've slowly seen the Department of Justice shift under this new administration. They've started flipping on where they were in voter ID cases in Texas, and at first they were against them, and now they're for the bill or the piece of legislation. So this wasn't completely out of left field, but you're right, the timing is incredibly suspicious, especially with the National Voter Registration Act. Now, what that bill does, this actually came, it's the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, and it was
Motor voter, which people know it as.
Yeah, and
more or
that's
less.
what it's
and
most.
the league very much was active in getting that passed.
And that is that's what it's probably most known for. But the second part, and one of the reasons it was introduced, was to kind of create this nice floor about voter registration throughout the country. We were seeing issues with voter purges in various states where they'd say, oh, you didn't vote for 2 elections, we're going to pull your registration, you obviously aren't here anymore because you didn't come vote. So what it did is it created kind of a floor, and that's what a lot of federal laws when it comes to voting have done, is create this kind of baseline of protections for voters. And the states can, have different methods of registration, but they have to at least do this. One of the things was the federal voter registration form that kind of codified it across all states. At the very least, they had to accept the federal voter registration form.
Right.
The second, and probably the most important that they did that we're worried about now, is when you can purge a voter.
Yes.
So right now, under federal law, if an individual lives at an address, even if they register and vote once, even if they don't vote again, they still are registered at that address. What happens and how someone can be removed from the list is 1, by death, 2, by here in Nebraska if they've committed a felony, and then the third is if they get what's called constructive notice. So, for example, say you move, you do a national change of address form, but you forget to re-register. At that point, the election commissioner will get notice that you've done this national change of address form. Or maybe mail comes back as undeliverable. They try to mail you something and it comes back to them. That's called constructive notice.
Okay.
They now have this inkling that perhaps you don't live there anymore. And all that does is it starts a clock. And it starts a clock where if you don't go and try to vote, not even just vote, like if you just don't go and try to vote for 2 federal election cycles, then they can remove you from the rolls. So say if you were a student like I was, I moved away for college, I still voted in Texas for a little bit. They had noticed that my mail was being forwarded to my campus address, but because I requested a mail ballot and sent it back to Texas, then it got erased. My status, which is called in NVRA, was cleared and I was fine. Once I eventually did a second change of address for when I started to live here permanently, they got the constructive notice, but by that time I had already re-registered in Nebraska and canceled my registration in Texas. So that's how the law works now. There's this clock, then you have to have 2 elections where you don't vote, and then at that point they presume, because they had an notice that you may have moved, and then that you haven't turned out to vote, then they can remove you from the rolls. And that's a nice safeguard to really make sure that you're only capturing those people that truly don't live in the state anymore or don't live at that address. What they're also required to do is send you a forwardable piece of mail. So once they get that national change of address or notice as undeliverable, they send a postcard to you that says, hey, we saw that you moved. Would you like to be registered at this address? And they send it to your new address. It's a nice postage paid postcard. You fill it out and send it back in. So these are some of the safeguards that the federal government put into place to make sure that people aren't being removed from the rolls for no reason, and making sure that election officials are taking some effort to educate voters about re-registering and updating their registration. And that's where Motor Voter came in, to make it easier for people when you go and get your new license to also register to vote, and really decrease some of that having to go to multiple state agencies when you could just go to one.
Right. And really that was the major focus of the National Voter Registration Act, was on the ways to help people register to vote and make it easier, and the purging of rolls was more of a secondarily housekeeping kind of effort.
Exactly.
And now it seems like the DOJ letter, though, has kind of flipped that.
Yeah, and that's a great point to say that the DOJ has flipped that. And I think what we're worried about is we're now seeing a complete shift in how the federal government views its roles in elections. We have a very decentralized election system here in the United States, where the federal government gives those type of baseline protections. You think of your classic, amendments. You can't be turned away because of your race. You can vote if you're a woman. You can vote as long as you're the age of 18. They do these baseline protections to give voters basic rights, and then the states really do a lot of the groundwork on how their elections are going to be run. And here in Nebraska, the counties are the ones that actually conduct the elections and do that poll worker training and ballot printing. So what I'm worried we're seeing is the federal government changing it. And instead of giving protections, they're now going to impose restrictions on states and on voters, possibly to the detriment of voter accessibility.
So I'm worried, is this a prelude, or are they gearing up for a campaign that's an enforcement campaign to accuse states of not kicking off enough people off the voter rolls? Do you think that's a possibility?
It's possible, because you've seen Mr. Kobach associate himself with some of the organizations that will do arbitrary analysis, where they'll look at projected census data and then current voter rolls, and then look at counties and say, oh, look, they're bloated. There's more people registered than the projected census data. Well, the projected census population is an estimate. It's not a definitive head count. But you see them starting to make those connections, saying, oh, look, there must be too many people. And so some of those organizations are closely tied to Mr. Kobach. And so I think we are seeing a prelude to, they're gearing up to be able to say, you're not doing it, we're going to do it. And we're going to make sure that these voters are purged or that they're removed.
Okay. So that's something definitely to watch and see where that's going. Another thing that's come up that people are nervous. They're scared about having their personal information shared in an unsecured way, particularly when you talk about Social Security numbers. So I think it's been reported that some people are actually canceling their registrations. And that's something that we really don't want to hear. Do you want to talk about that and why people shouldn't do that?
Yeah, there was a great article in the Lincoln Journal-Star today by Chris Dunker that he talked to a couple of the county election officials and what they've been hearing on the ground. And there's been a lot of inquiries. Luckily, not many have fallen through with it. And that's also a concern for us is once you remove yourself, yes, your data is definitely protected because you've removed yourself, but then you've lost all opportunity to really have your voice heard, and our democracy only works when it's representative and reflective of everyone in that district and in our state. Also, removing and canceling it now is no guarantee that it won't currently be on the list and what's sent. So we're trying to talk to voters and let them know that one, your Social Security number will not be included just by how Nebraska stores its data. So the state law and the state legislature has done a great job protecting you there. But then also, because of what Secretary Gale has said and the fact that the commission has backed off, we'd caution people to not take that drastic action of removing themselves from their roles and just trust that organizations like the League of Women Voters, NCR, and ACLU are going to do everything we can to protect voters and stop it from ever getting to that point.
Right. Well, we just have a couple minutes left, but other things to be concerned about with voting, and I think maybe the shift should be more toward the hacking stories we're hearing about, not so much people registering illegally, but that we have problems with having our voting system compromised. Do you want to talk about that just briefly? Yeah,
and we're actually nationwide, we're at a precipice. We're at a point that a lot of states have to grapple with how are they going to update and improve election technology. In 2003, through the Help America Vote Act, the federal government made a huge investment in the states in helping them obtain a lot of election technology, as well as being able to modernize how voter information is stored and compiled. And so I think we're looking at a time where if the federal government is going to spend any money, we'd rather, instead of spending it on this commission, they spend on reinvesting in that security, reinvesting in that technology, giving states the tools and the technology they need to conduct elections efficiently, securely, and make sure that they're doing everything they can to protect voters. So that's why we've been working with the Election Technology Committee here in Nebraska, as well as with the National Council of State Legislatures. So I think that's what we should be focusing on, and what we'd ask any voters or interested parties to contact Secretary Gale about is, let's talk about how we can invest in our technology and stop running around and trying to collect data just to be able to purge voters. Okay, and the other thing Nebraskans should be feel good about is that we still use paper ballots in Nebraska. Yes. So that's kind of like we're ahead of the game there. So. And that's actually helped a lot with some of the wait times we've seen in other states with voting machines that fail or break down. We're lucky in that paper ballots, they'll still work whether or not there's internet. All right, well, Bree, thank you so much for talking about this, and also we want to assure viewers that our organizations will be on top of this. Look at our Facebook pages. We always have information there. So thank you so much. So for the League of Women Voters, I'm Geri Simon, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues, and at election time, go vote, Omaha.